So, hi everyone. We talked a bit about history. If you want to know more, the best way to do it is to read some books. So I'm going to recommend some books. There's some fascinating literature out there on Canadian whiskey. The first one I want to recommend is Canadian Whiskey by Davin Dukergimo. This really is, the complete guidebook to Canadian whiskey. Davin does a really good job of talking about how Canadian whiskey is made, who makes it, what makes it special. He tells a lot of stories, and he kind of really does a really good job of talking about Canadian whiskey in a way that's appealing to people who are brand new and just want to know roughly what's going on, but also to people who want to know what kind of stills are at the distilleries and what kind of spirits do they make, and people who want a bit more of the technical detail. So highly recommend Davin's book. It's an excellent resource and really is a starting point for anyone who wants to understand Canadian whiskey a bit more. I'll include these names in the video description as well. Another one, if you can find it, that's just really interesting is another book called Canadian Whiskey by William Ranny. What makes this book interesting for me is it's, again, similar to Davin's book in that it talks about the industry and the history and tells some different stories, but it was written in the 70s, and so just a different time and just a different voice. So I recommend that as well. It's not as comprehensive, but it is quite informative. As I said, out of print might be hard to find, but if you can find it anywhere, grab it and read it. This book as well is really great. It's called Booze, Boats, and Billions. It's probably my favorite book, not in terms of understanding what Canadian whiskey is, but just the stories, the way it's written. It's awesome. It's about smuggling whiskey across Lake Ontario during Prohibition. It's told great. It's by C.W. Hunt. It is out of print, but you can still find used versions pretty readily online, and so just a great book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. So that kind of gives you a bit of an introduction to what was happening around the Great Lakes with whiskey during Prohibition, through the 1920s, and talks a bit about some of the key players and distillers at the time. But the stories are just great. So highly recommend that. And then we have a few other ones that are a little more focused on some other areas. One that I'd recommend just because it's so important to Canadian whiskey history is the Bronfmans, The Rise and the Fall of the House of Seagram by Nicolas. This isn't a story about whiskey. This is the story about how a whiskey empire was built and what was happening at the time. And so this is the story of, it starts with Sam Bronfman and then goes to his kids. Sam Bronfman founded Crown Royal, which is Canada's biggest whiskey brand, and through a number of brilliant moves was able to build up the largest liquor company in the world, Seagram's, which was a Canadian company, which was eventually dissolved for various reasons, and really dissolved into what are now the largest whiskey companies in the world, or spirits companies in the world. But just the Bronfmans, really important to Canadian whiskey and history, and this is a bit of a deeper dive into how that developed and what was going on, so I recommend that as well. The last book I'll recommend today on Canadian whiskey is called Blending 101 by Dr. Don Livermore. He's the current master distiller at Hiram Walker Distillery, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, Canadian distillery, with Crown Royal being the other. It's really interesting because it goes through Canadian history, but from a perspective of how Canadian whiskey was made. So it's a bit less about the people, and kind of that side, and more about how it was made and how it was made change over time. So what grains were they using? How are they aging it? All this stuff. Fascinating. There's really not another book like this. And I love it because he actually lists recipes, from the 1800s and the early 1900s, and he actually kind of opens the recipe book that they have at Hiram Walker. So just a really, really interesting perspective if you're kind of curious about, how Canadian whiskey's made and what's changed over time. Really good. It does have a bit of a slant towards Hiram Walker's brands. So Weiser's Lot 40, Good Herman Wart's Pike Creek, because it is a publication of Corby's, who are owned by Pernod Ricard. But I mean, in this book anyway, it's pretty solid, and it doesn't. I really can't say anything bad about it. I do want to recommend one other book or class of books. It's not about Canadian whiskey, but really important. One I'll recommend is Bourbon Empire. What was happening in the U.S. really impacted what happened in Canada, and so, if you're really interested in more of a holistic picture about Canadian whiskey history, understanding what was happening in the U.S. with bourbon really helps you understand kind of the times and even what made Canadian whiskey different than American whiskey. So, Bourbon Empire by Reid, Mittenbueller is a great place to start. There's lots of great books on bourbon, but this is one that I have particularly enjoyed, and it does a really good job of talking about bourbon. And if you've done some research on Canadian history and then you read some of this, you'll start to see some really interesting links. So I'd recommend that as well. There are other books, but I'll leave it there for now. That gives you a good foundation. And again, I'll come back to the fact that if you just want one place to start, Canadian Whiskey by Davin and Kergommeaux, terrific book. Start there and then see where you want to go. So thanks for tuning in. I'll put something else up soon.